David Newman's work on political boundaries has often had deep relevance for understanding the conflict with the Palestinians. He has a deep appreciation for religious aspects of Anglo-Jewish history, both for its rabbis, many of whom were family members, and the synagogues they served. He has been successful in gathering together some like-minded individuals who like to discuss aspects of Jewish history in Britain. And perhaps he will be able to tell us about his thoughts and plans later. Tonight, he will talk about a rabbinic conference that took place more than a century ago in Caesarea in 1920, which was significant in drawing the lines of what Orthodoxy sought to defend in Britain, and the relationship of regional rabbis with the chief rabbi and the London Beth Din. So without further ado, I will give the floor to our speaker.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I've got a loud voice, so if this doesn't work, I think you can all hear me well enough, right? The question you should ask is, of course, what is a professor of geopolitics giving a lecture about a rabbinical conference that took place in England at the beginning of the 20th century? And the answer is, certainly for those of you who are academics know, that we all have on the side, we all get paid to do our professional research. And on the side, when the going gets tough, we always have the escapism of some hobby research. So Anglo-Jewish history in the last 10 years has become very much my hobby research, which has become more and more serious over time. It started, as you probably will understand, I'm sure it's many of you, started with a bit of nostalgia, looking into family history. When I went for other reasons to London, taking another day or two to go into the archives, the LMA in particular, where a lot of the Bet Din and the Board of Deputies and Chief Rabbi's archives are. And one thing leads you on to another and another. And so I'm enjoying more my Anglo-Jewish historical research now than my geopolitics. And as I formally retire in 3 months' time, I think this is going to be the direction I'm going to take over the next few years. A number of particular topics which have become of interest to me has certainly been the history of communities and their Rabbanim, particularly within the Orthodox world. One thing has led to another, and I also have a side interest. Some of you may have heard me before. I have a particular interest in the David Hillman stained glass windows. I'm going to mention David Hillman's father tonight, Rav Shmuel Hillman, who's one of the stars, one of the celebs of what I'm going to talk about tonight. I know 3 or 4 or 5 of you who know what the Aseifat, or the Conference of Leeds Rabbis, in 1911 was. So perhaps much of what I say, apart from the wider context, may not be new to you. But I would like to imagine, I am assuming, that most of you saw the title and said, never heard of it before. And which is normally the case. And one of the questions I'm going to ask, because I'm going to make out that this was quite an important event that took place within the world of Orthodoxy in the early years of the 20th century. And maybe one of the questions I'm going to leave unanswered at the end was, well, maybe it was very important for those of us who are interested in it, but did it really actually have a major long-term impact or effect on Orthodox Jewry? It's an open question, but it's an interesting case study anyway. The other thing I've learned from taking on hobby research is that when I was dean for 6 years, one of the things a dean has to do, he has to sort of negotiate between the faculty and the administration of the university. And they're more interested in making sure things run well financially and efficiently, and that people finish their degrees in time. And faculty and students have rather different opinions on that matter. And one of the things that, as a dean of both social sciences and humanities together, was I always used to get a bit annoyed with the historians that their students never ever finished their PhDs within the given 4 years of the grant. They always needed another year and another year. And I used to say, what's going on here? And they say, well, look, we were working in the archives last week and we came upon a great new document, Revelation. We have to investigate it. I never really understood. I said, look, you've got to close the frame and do what you're meant to do for your PhD. You can do that another time. Since I've started working my way around archives in the last 10 years, I understand them perfectly. Because every time I go to the archives, particularly the LMA, which is an amazing treasure trove of unresearched stuff, I always find something else. I'll just give you one example. About 3 years ago, I was looking for something to do with a particular Jewish community post-World War II, and I suddenly saw, because now it's been catalogued online, thanks to a Rothschild grant, that the material isn't there. You have to go physically there to see it. It's much too much to get digitized. And I came across a file of 32 original letters of Diana Brumsky.
Wow.
So, but as I say, archives take you off in many different directions, which has proved to be the case with the topic I'm going to talk about tonight. It's, I thought a few months ago when I gave this idea, it will be a finished topic by the time I come to speak about it. But there's a lot more to be looked at, and we shall just touch the tip of it tonight. Let me just tell you in 2 sentences what the conference, or the Aseifat, or the Aseifat, as probably the Haredim would say, of rabbis was. In 1911, in March 1911, a group mostly of provincial, there were 1 or 2 from London, but they were nearly all provincial rabbis. The main London participant was Rabbi Dr. Avigdor Schonfeld, the father of Solomon Schonfeld, decided to challenge more publicly the authority of the chief rabbinate, Chief Rabbi Herman Adler at the time. Now, as you will see, we'll talk about context. This was something which had been brewing up for a long time, since many of the Eastern European Jews and rabbis had been coming from the late 19th century and through the early 20th century. And they called together a big conference where they discussed matters of religion and orthodoxy. And if, as we shall see in a few minutes, you're to believe the Jewish Chronicle, this was a major, major issue. It was over the Chronicle, 2 or 3 pages in the Chronicle for every week for about 5 or 6 weeks after it took place. The only other event in the 20th century I can think which took up so much space in the Jewish Chronicle over such a short space of time was probably the Louis Jacobs affair, which was a much longer thing. But anyway, so at the time it was obviously considered something very important, plus the fact it brought together a lot of personalities. If I was to use modern terminology and think about football stars, excuse lahavdil, it brings together a lot of the celebs of the very impressive and important group of Lithuanian rabbis who came to England in the early and mid-20th century. You know, when we talk about religious world today, for people certainly below the age of 50, as far as they're concerned, Orthodoxy, the only real Orthodox communities in history has existed in America and Israel. And very few of them are aware that actually in the first part of the last century, England or the United Kingdom, excuse me if anyone's Scottish or Welsh or Irish, the United Kingdom was a recipient of a very serious group of leading Lithuanian Rabbanim, Poskim, whether it was in Glasgow or Leeds or Liverpool or Manchester or Dublin, and even many other much smaller towns, and most of whom, by the way, tended to retire and come to live in Eretz Israel long before the state was founded. Not all of them. Some died in England, some stayed in England, but most of them did. And maybe if you saw them in their pictures today, you say, oh, these aren't Zionists. But I think these terms of what Zionism and Haredim, I was actually very interested to see that the word Haredim is actually used in the title of the conference, because I didn't think that this was a term that was used at that time, although it probably had a slightly different meaning.
It was used for religious education as well.
Yeah. But a very serious group of rabbis, and a lot of whom will actually, as I say, I've got a lot of pictures here. A lot of them are the celebs of this talk, and many aren't even mentioned because they came later or they weren't involved in this. But it is, and I've always been actually enamored by that so many came to England. It makes sense, doesn't it, that communities came. England or the United Kingdom is much, much closer than America. Some did go to America, but the UK was much closer. Everyone became the rabbi of a town or part of a town, or part of a community, and they had a lot of correspondence with each other, a lot of hitkatfut with each other and with the great Rabbanim of Eastern Europe of the time, be it the Netziv of Volozhin or Rav Shmuel Salam to Rav Yochanan Spector. We see a lot of correspondence in that field, and a lot of them, as I know from my own grandfather, parents and great-grandparents' stories of the Rabbinowitzes and the Hillmans and the Herzogs, a lot of them in the first generation only married their children to the children of each other because they didn't trust the kashrut of the English Jews. So that in itself is an interesting story, and this is part of this story. So let's go through. I've got a big PowerPoint here. I'm going to rush through. I'm going to focus on some of the slides but miss some of the others out. And now I can see we've left it dormant so long we have to get it working again, the PowerPoint. Let's just, okay, how do we get this to work again? I know you're not meant to leave a PowerPoint dormant for too long. Oh, maybe here. Okay, so the main questions I want to ask are, first of all, what was the Leeds Aseifat? Or Aseifat meaning a meeting. What the context? Who were the personalities involved? What were the short and long-term consequences? And I asked at the beginning, was it actually significant, or just for those of us who have either a family or a personal interest in Orthodox history, was it only really important for them, or did it have greater significance or not? I can probably answer the first three questions. The fourth one is open to interpretations. Very quickly, the timelines we're going to look at, you can see on the left the events and on the right the personalities, and they tend to correspond with each other. You have, in terms of events, the influx of the Orthodox Jews from Eastern Europe, late 19th century, into a community which, as you know, was partly Germanic and partly Spanish-Portuguese. Remember the famous letter sent by Chief Rabbi Adler to Eastern Europe saying, stop sending us your poor Orthodox Jews because they're creating anti-Semitism here. Correspondence between the London Dayanim, even of the 19th century, and I assume some of you may know about, have seen this great book that came out a few years ago by Eli Friedwald about the rabbi's suitcase of all the correspondence that took place back in the 19th century between the Dayanim then, Dayan Reinhardt, as the agent of Chief Rabbi Adler, with many of the major Rabbanim in Eastern Europe. As the fight of the Orthodox against the establishment, the Anglo establishment, you had the founding of the Federation, the founding of the Mahzikei Abbas, another important book, of course, Bernard Homer's book, and sometimes it's very interesting to compare the Bernard Homer narrative with the Eli Friedwald narrative, particularly about issues of kashrut, and who really got the letters that counted, or who was simply just better at publishing them. Same problem we have today with social media. There was a famous Liverpool Shechita court case in 1904, and then there was a period where there were lots of conferences going on. There was a big Orthodox Aseifat of Rabbanim in St. Petersburg in 1910. There was an Anglo-Jewish ministers' conference, which were very different rabbis, all Orthodox, but with a very different style, a very Anglo style. Also in 1910, we come to the Aseifat in Leeds in 1911. Then there was another Anglo-Jewish ministers' conference which tried to counterbalance this, founding of Agudat Yisrael, and much, much later in 1926, but also as a long-term feed-on from these ongoing sort of sensitivities, the founding of the Union of the Orthodox Hebrew Congregations, much later in the late 20s, but still with Rabbi Victor Schonfeld involved. He was one person who was involved in 1911 and was very involved again in 1926. The personalities that were involved in and out of this, we have, because we're focusing on the event taking place in Leeds, was Rabbi Yisrael Chaim Daiches, who was the Rav of Leeds for a long time. He was very involved in this conference. We have Rabbi Shmuel Hillman, who I'm going to speak a fair bit about, not just about his history, but about something that happened here in Jerusalem yesterday in his name. Rabbi Joel Herzog, who was the father.
If you're not using the microphone, you can see from your feet.
Yes, that'd be great. Who was the father of the Chief Rabbi Herzog, and although we know that the Herzog family have a long pedigree of rabbis and presidents, we know less about Rabbi Joel Herzog, but he was a major figure here. Chief Rabbi changed from Adler to Hertz. Rabbi Hillman comes to London as the head of London Beth Din. And you can see the names Schonfeld, Hillman, Abramsky. They were all part of this story. Part of the Anglo-Jewish community, but partly not, trying to push different values. And this is the sort of events and story that we want to follow through here tonight. At the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, the Rabbanim from Eastern Europe were challenging the Anglo aristocracy, let's call it the Chief Rabbinate, on all religious issues, but the one issue that always comes back time and time again is the issue of kashrut and shchita. The Anglo kashrut and shchita isn't good enough, the shochtim aren't careful enough, the butchers aren't religious enough. I always laugh at that because when I was going through the archives, I suddenly came across a letter from the 1960s or 70s where someone from, I think it was at the Wembley Synagogue of Golders Green, writes a letter to Diane Swift at the London Basin. He says, how can such and such be a kosher butcher? He was sitting 3 rows in front of me at Tottenham this last Shabbos afternoon. I never found the answer. And as some of you know, if I've read Tottenham supports, really interested me a great deal. But even back then, there was a great deal of toing and froing about kashrut and shchita. There were letters from the people in the UK to great Rabbanim back in Eastern Europe. If you were to read Bernard Homer's account, you would get the impression that the opponents of the chief rabbi were the people who really came out on top. This was what the Machzikei Das was about, the wars on kashrus right through to Diana Abramsky. They were and were not part of the federation. And yet, when you read Eddie Friedwald's book, you see that the Chief Rabbi Adler and Dein Reinhardt received letters from some of the most significant Rabbanim in Eastern Europe, from Rabbi Cholon Spector, from Rav Shmuel Salant, basically saying, we rely on their knowledge, and it's important not to separate the community. But at the time, this wasn't given dissemination that it was, and there's still a lot to be got out of this suitcase of letters. Eddie Friedwald has only touched the tip of the iceberg in what he published recently. So the Wars of the Kashrut were a big thing. They're the 2 books I'm talking about. And another thing that's often asked is, well, along came these big Rabbanim from Eastern Europe, and these were true Talmidei Chachamim, Gedolei Torah, and so on, and these were just the Anglo rabbis. But if you look at the 2 Dayanim, Sussman Cohen and Reinhardt, and you look at the pedigree of Chief Rabbi Adler, these were also very significant Talmidei Chachamim. They may have adopted more Anglo styles. They may have been more makel in the way they went around adapting to their Anglo populations, but these were very serious Talmidei Chachamim, and that's very clear when you read their biographies and so on. 2 chief rabbis who were involved in this process, of course, Chief Rabbi Herman Adler, and when he died in 1911, he was eventually replaced by Chief Rabbi Dr. Joseph Hertz, who of course was Chief Rabbi for over 30 years through both World Wars and had a very significant impact on the Orthodox community of Anglo Jewry. There was a famous case in Liverpool in 1904, which the Jewish Chronicle gives over many pages to, where there was a libel case brought. I'm trying to think who against who. Was it Rabbi? No, it was against. It was by some of the religious Rabbanim against the chief rabbi who had questioned, who had tried not to authorize the shochtim that the religious Rabbanim had given hechsher to. And there was a big court case, and it was covered in a great deal by the local press. One of the things the judges say at the end is that we don't understand why you had to bring this to the civil courses. You should have sorted it out within the community. And 2 of the Rabbanim who gave came to give evidence on behalf of the religious Rabbanim. One was Rabbi Abba Werner, who was the esteemed veteran Rav of the Machzikei Hadas, and another was my great-grandfather, Rabbi Yaakov Rabinovich, who was then the Rav in Edinburgh. This is a younger version of him, and they both tried to explain to the judge how they give the hechsher to Shoftim, and neither of them could speak English very well. One actually asked for an interpreter, and in the case of Abba Werner, the judge started speaking to him in German, and he was extremely critical also of these foreign Rabbanim who came over, and maybe they were learned, but they didn't go according to the rules of the Anglo-Jewish authority. And he said, and if you're community leaders and you've been here a few years, he said quite openly, it's about time you studied and spoke English a little bit better. But this was a very publicized case in the wars of religion generally, and in the wars of kashrut altogether. About 1909-1910, the Anglo-Jewish ministers, the Orthodox Anglo-Jewish ministers, had their own first conference, which was all about procedure. It wasn't really about religious matters. It was about how we should arrange ourselves better, how we should organize ourselves better, how we should have better communication with the provincial communities. And most of the other Rabbanim were from provincial communities, so they probably saw this as a bit of a threat as well to their own authority within the provincial communities. As I said, there was a big Orthodox Aseifat in St. Petersburg, which probably they obviously knew about because they were writing back and forth with their colleagues in Eastern Europe. It probably gave them a bit of a push to go ahead and do their own thing. And then they decided they're going to have their own meeting of Orthodox Rabbanim. Thank you very much. Of the Orthodox Rabbanim. At first it was going to be in London, but then they settled on Leeds. I suppose both for geographical reasons, as most of them were from the provinces, and probably because it would have been harder to organise in London. There may have been greater opposition there. And the fact that Leeds at the time was considered to be the place for orthodoxy outside London before Manchester took over. Leeds was the place where many very significant Rabbanim came to. My cousin showed me an article recently, I can't remember where someone even referred to it as the Jerusalem of England. Like Vilna was described as the Jerusalem of Lithuania. So Leeds was the place at the time. They had some very significant Rabbanim, and they started planning. They made an announcement that we're going to have this meeting to talk about the state of religion, orthodoxy, in the United Kingdom. I've got lots of slides like this. You're not going to be able to read them. What I want to show you is just what an amazing coverage it got in the papers. When it first came out, two of the Rabbanim who were involved, Rabbi Horowitz of Leeds, Rabbi Yoffe of Manchester.
But it's not Horowitz, it's Hurwitz.
Hurwitz, sorry, okay. Hurwitz and Rabbi Yoffe gave an interview in the Jewish Chronicle explaining why they wanted to have this meeting. And the interview rather fell flat, because they spoke about, not about Shechita, they spoke about all other Jewish Orthodox practices which were common in Eastern Europe, and we know from the world religion, which today in their opinion were being ignored and in the new world of England. And as a result of which there was a great deal of discussion both before and after the conference about it in the British Jewish press and in a lot of the Yiddish and other press. I've got mostly the Jewish Chronicle stuff. I've spent hours looking through the Jewish Chronicle archives. That's a treasure also in its own right. So they had lots of letters about should this conference be held, and then Horowitz, and Yoffe wrote back to the Jewish Chronicle defending their interview after they'd been criticized, saying we don't want to cause machlokas. The whole idea of what we're doing is to bring shalom to the Jewish community, that everybody should operate in the same way. Rabbi Hillman, who's going to feature in a few minutes, he was one of the organizers, probably the main organizer. He was then the Rav of Glasgow. He'd come over in 1908 to be the Rav of Glasgow. Very significant rabbinical family, very significant indeed. And he was the person who pushed for this. He'd become quite well known in 1910 when Rabbi Eliezer Gordon, the Rosh Hashiva of Telz, came to London and died suddenly, and he was called from Glasgow to give the main hesped for him, and this attracted tens of thousands of people. And he was the main instigator, and he wrote many letters to people all over the country telling them to come. And as I saw in the archives, he got there about 50 telegrams in his personal archives here in the Sifriya Leumit, most of which said the same thing. We think this is very important, we wish you great success, but sorry, we can't come. Some did come, because it's very hard to work out actually from the conference itself, apart from the 6 or 7 big names who run the conference, how many people actually participated. I don't think it was such a huge number, but it was just the names of the people who were giving the talks that attracted the headlines. And of course travel wasn't so easy in those days. And then we come to the Aseifat itself, and we'll look at this. This is the invitation. I'll tell you how I came by an original copy of the invitation in a few minutes, quite a story. But it was meant to take place in March in Leeds, B'chirat Vad HaAseifat, selecting the committee, and the main themes in this talk were Harav Horowitz, then of Sunderland, before he moved on, Chinuch Rabbanim. How should we educate our children? We're not giving them good enough Orthodox religious education. Taharat HaMishpacha, Shmaryahu Bloch, very serious Rav. Son-in-law was Rav Kerzner, about Taharat HaMishpacha, which of course was an issue amongst people who had not grown up in Eastern Europe. Shayat HaGitin, Gitin and Chalitza, negated by Harav Hillman. Negative Bolalut, against assimilation, Harav Yofi. What about Mezuzot, V'tfilin, V'tzitzit, Harav Daiches in Leeds. Shmirat Shabbat, Harav Rabinovitz, the one from Liverpool, who Gabriel has written so much about, who was one of the main powerhouses of Mizrahi of the early part of the century. Histadrut HaRabbanut, but you can see by Harav Schonfeld, Victor Schonfeld from London, the difference between the nature of these two conferences. The Anglo-Jewish conference, which as I say were Orthodox rabbis, but they were more involved in the organization and the management, and along came these Orthodox rabbis and challenged them as to what they believed were the real heart of the matter about the religious issues which should be discussed. And this is the same meeting in English.
What were they doing? If that was in Hebrew,
I would assume that it was mostly in Yiddish. I would assume. It could have been a lot of English.
Anglo-Jewish one was
No, but it was meant for a certain population. But I think there was a fair amount of English as well, because it was covered quite well. Who are the celebs? Who are the participants? Nice set of mugshots here. I've mentioned them all. Rabbi Shmaryahu Bloch, who was then in Birmingham. He has a great grandson today, Modi'in Elite, who collects lots of letters and information about his family. Rabbi Dr. Victor Schonfeld, father of Solomon Schonfeld, Israel Chaim Deiches, Shmuel Yaakov Rabinovich, Rabbi Hirsch Horowitz, Sunderland and Leeds, Israel Yofi Manstein, Rabbi Shmuel Hillman. This was, as I said at the beginning, very serious group of Lithuanian Rabbanim who were taken very seriously in the world of Piskei Halacha and Sheilot and Tshuvot. A little aside as we go on. Where was Rabbi Yoel Herzog at the time? He was an important Haredi rabbi in Leeds itself, been there since 1900. Where was he? He wasn't involved in it at all. Virtually at exactly the same time as this conference took place, he accepted a call to go and be the rabbi of Paris. He left Leeds at more or less the same time and went to be in Paris, where he was for the next 20 plus years until he passed away. And then his son, Yitzchak Halevi, took him to Israel to be buried. He and Rabbi Yitzchak Halevi Herzog and Rav Shmuel Hillman, they're all buried here in the Sanhedria cemetery at the corner of Sanhedria and Ramat Eshkol here in Yerushalayim. There was as you can understand, there was a machlokas going on. between him and Rav Daichus. Rav Daichus wanted to set up a cross-community based in. And Rav Herzog was a rabbi of what they called the amalgamated synagogues, which were basically the smaller Yiddish-speaking synagogues in Leeds, and they weren't prepared to give up. It obviously led to a lot of tensions, and eventually he decided he's going to go somewhere else. So at the time they were preparing this Aseifat, which he would have probably agreed with, he was negotiating a new position in Paris at the time. He went to Paris in 1911, as I say, remained there until he passed away. There were lots of Rabinowitzes at the Aseifat. There was Rav Shmuel Yaakov Rabinovich, who Gabriel has written about, from Liverpool, major leader in world Mizrahi and one of the founders of British Mizrahi. There was on the far left Rav Yaakov Rabinovich, my own great-grandfather, who was then in Edinburgh, eventually came to London to be the Rav of the Montague Road Base of Medrash till he died. And there was a Rav David Rabinovitz, then of Sunderland. And this is an interesting story, how I came about the original copy of the invitation. I get a phone call, this is about 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, from this same person I mentioned in Modi'in Elite, who collects information about rabbis in general, but is descended from Shmariel Bloch. And he said, look, someone has just given me to look at this invitation about an Aseifat Rabbanim in Leeds. He said, I know nothing about it, what do you know about it? So I said, I told him what I knew about it. I said, where did you get it from? He said, well, there's a Rav in Israel called Rav Moshe Eliyahu Rabinovich, whose father has just passed away. He also had a little box of documents, and he came across this, and he realized that his great-grandfather, who was Rav Dodra, must have been involved in this, but he knows nothing more about it. The funny thing is, who is this Rav? He is a religious Zionist rabbi from the Yeshuv of Bet Chagai, which is 20 minutes by road from where I live in Meitar. He's a Rosh Kollel in Bet Chagai. He himself actually hadn't been born in England, he'd been born already in South Africa. One of the grandchildren had gone to South Africa. So I went to see him and we had a big schmooze about this thing, that it was actually his great-grandfather who obviously had the original copy of this invitation, and it had passed down amongst the generations and come to him here in Israel, and he wanted to know more about it. So there were Rabinowitzes, none of these Rabinowitzes were related to each other. Because Rabinowitz was the name that rabbis' families gave each other in Eastern Europe at the time. Rabin is a rabbi's family, so you had many different Rabinowitzes, and I often have questions, I'm a Rabinowitz, so I know someone Rabinowitz, he must have been related to your great-grandfather or to this person. In many cases it's simply not the case. Actually, rabbis' families, you tend to know the genealogy very well, because rabbis' families tend to document it in the openings of their Sfarim. They say who they are, who their father was, who their grandfather was, where he was rabbi, where he was based in. So actually you obviously have very clear family trees in that. The one major London representative was Rabbi Dr. Victor Schonfeld. He was very interested in chinuch in particular more than anything else. So he came at the beginning of the century. He became very friendly with Rav Kook when Rav Kook was in England. Rav Kook in the Grot HaRa'aya, the letters of Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook. There's the whole hesped that Rav Kook sent to England at the death of Rav Schonfeld, and he didn't have a habit of giving big hesped in Rav Kook. Schonfeld did actually try for 2 years in Palestine, and he came back to England, and in the late 1920s he was responsible for setting up the Union of Orthodox Congregations. He was the first head. The Adas Yisrael was actually off Green Lanes in Burma Road, just around the corner from where I grew up, in Poets Road. But by the time we got there, it wasn't there anymore. It was already in Queen Elizabeth Walk in Stamford Hill, in Stoke Newington. And he, as you know, passed away at a young age. His son, Rabbi Dr. Solomon Schonfeld, took over, and he has his own very interesting history, which I see a good friend of mine here, Les Glassman, who discovered Rabbi Dr. Schonfeld late in his life, right? But he's done a fantastic job of interviewing many of the Schonfeld survivors from the Kindertransport, and you should look them up on the YouTube and see them. But I knew Dr. Solomon Schonfeld when I was a young kid living in Newington Green. I went to the Avigdor Primary School, which was named after Avigdor Schonfeld. And I'll take questions at the end if you don't mind. Yeah.
I was there also.
Okay, so I remember every Friday Solomon Schonfeld, who was the head of the Jewish secondary school, used to come and give us fire and brimstone on Friday mornings. That's what I remember of him. His whole amazing history about the kinder transport and the children came over was actually not well known at the time. It came out much later, mostly after he passed away, because he himself was a bit of a maverick figure in the later years of his life. And then, I'm going to rush through the next few slides, we have over the next month, after the conference, 2 or 3 pages in every week's Jewish Chronicle are given over, first of all, to explaining what went on at the Aseifat. First of all, there was a whole row of letters of people who said, what do we need this for? These people have come from Eastern Europe, we're already Anglo-Jews, they should fit in with our styles and our habits. And what are they bringing up? I'll read one out in a minute. These antiquated customs like Taharat HaMishpacha, like wearing a shaitel, they all came out tremendously powerfully against the idea. You know, if that's what they want, they should have stayed in Eastern Europe. This is not part of our Judaism and Orthodoxy. And who are they to challenge the authority of the church? That was the first round of responses to the conference. Then, of course, you had people coming back who were at the conference, some for, some against. I have to say, to the credit of the Jewish Chronicle at the time, they gave a lot of space to both supporters and opponents of this particular conference. It wasn't just reported in England, it was reported, by the way, obviously in the Yiddish press in England, but also in Hatzfirah, in the religious press around the world, and so on and so on. I could go on, I just don't have time to read this through, I can send you the material, but literally for 6 consecutive weeks, it took up 2 or 3 pages, the fors and against of what they went on. It's just an example. Each of these slides simply shows a different week. March the 17th, March the 24th, March the 31st, April the 7th, April the 14th. So this was a big discussion going on at the time. And of course, as I said, one of the big critiques of the Leeds conference was, I say, those who held it very much in ridicule. If I'll just read this out, this is blowing it up from one of the letters in the Jewish Chronicle. The Conference of Rabbis at Leeds, whose proceedings I recorded last week, does not appear to have secured much sympathy in the community. The opening presidential address of Rabbi Deichers is applauded, but the later discussion of the topics that raised them are ridiculed. One leading organ of the community refers to this impudent conference, while another declares that the rabbis who were there covered their conference with ridicule and gave a handle, listen to this phrase, to those who are constantly striving to play pranks with Judaism and call it reform. It is urged in other words, the conference urged it is urged by people here that Judaism does not ask for the clock of time to be set back, and the resolutions passed by the rabbis who attended the Leeds conference are declared to be nonsensical. A conclave is declared to have been turned into a solemn farce. The rabbis who there met had a great opportunity which they misused by turning it into a fantastic campaign for the revival of obsolete barbarism.
Wow.
The rabbi's denouncement of dancing, of going to the theatre, and the commendation of shaitels for women is held to be their message to 20th century Anglo Jewry, and it has raised a peal of laughter from the tents of Shem. That was some of the critique. And you had something similar in another critique. The average Anglo-Jewish minister, as he is, should in this matter walk humbly. Our ministers have the laugh for the moment of the rabbis, and they are apt to forget that they inhabit houses of glass. And a lot of this was not just coming from the general community, it was coming from the mainstream Orthodox community, of the chief rabbinate and so on, not the chief rabbi himself, but obviously of people who supported the chief rabbinate. And even when we analyse, 50 years on, so a well-known Jewish historian, Lloyd Gartner, who wasn't for or against, he sort of summed up the conference, and he himself in his book, Jewish Immigrants in England, he writes, there was a conference in Leeds, the rabbis, most of whom were from the provinces, debated with vigour and some disorder and show of emotion. Then the conference hotly argued matters like phylacteries, prayer shawls, ritual baths, and the dangers of theatre. One of the resolutions admonished every married woman to shave her head and don a wig, while another called on Jews to stay away from dance and theatre. So this was the general impression that was got even by a very respectable historian many years later. And Bernard Homer slightly challenges that assumption. He says, you know, this is all he writes about in his whole book about the conference. He says this was, in a sense, he says that you must remember the Rabbanim had been regarded disparagingly as foreign rabbis, and they were even termed uncultivated, uncivilized people, and they'd held a conference, and they hadn't really been paid much regard. So Bernard Homer obviously was supportive of them, and he was basically saying that this is the way they'd been attacked and misunderstood at the time. They had another Anglo-Jewish conference a year later. Who was elected as president of the Anglo-Jewish conference? The only one of the British Dayanim at the time who'd actually attended the Leeds Aseifat, Dayan Hyamson. So maybe this was felt a way to sort of soften the blow. Both Chief Rabbi Adler, who died very shortly afterwards, and then Chief Rabbi Hertz tried very hard to sort of regain control or maintain control. Now, I would argue that Chief Rabbi Hertz, both when he appointed Rabbi Hillman and 20 years later when he appointed Rabbi Dayan Abramsky, it was also part of trying to maintain control to appoint such two significant Lithuanian Gedolim, Poskei Halacha, was obviously a way of his to try and sort of keep reins on the matter and keep control of the matter. The following year, Agudas Israel was created for the first time in Katowice, and the two English representatives at that conference were Rabbis Hillman and Deichers. So you can see the connection between these things. Dr. Adler passed away, and we had a new chief rabbi, Rabbi Dr. Joseph Hertz. One of the first things he did, because he had to appoint a new Av based in, was to bring Rabbi Hillman to London. You would argue that that was very good politics. On the one hand, he was aware that Hillman was or one of the two or three authorities respected most by the Haredi Rabbanim at the time. And I don't know, Kenneth, you can probably answer me on this. Probably Rabbi Hillman saw Glasgow as a bit of a small shot compared to London. This was a much bigger game on which to play, and without taking anything away from Rabbi Hillman whatsoever. He left Glasgow, he came to London, and I just have a little digression here about the Hillman-Herzog relationship, but for two reasons. One, because it's a fascinating relationship. Do you know Dayan Hillman's daughter became the wife of Chief Rabbi Herzog? In other words, he and Rabbi Yoel Herzog were mechutonim. And hey, guess what? After Rabbi Hillman left Glasgow to London, and Herzog had been 2.5 years in Paris, he was actually approached to be the new Dayan of the Rav of Glasgow. He was actually appointed. He must have accepted the position and then decided not to, or maybe the Parisians told him, look, you've only just come here, it's not very nice to leave us so suddenly. But you know, again, it was all in the family, you could say. And of course the Herzog family, you can see that lots of rabbis here, no presidents in this picture, although they had two presidents as well. Rabbi Yoel Herzog, Rabbi Isaac Halevi Herzog, and for those of you who may have forgotten this, Rabbi Herzog's son, the brother of President Chaim Herzog, Yaakov Herzog, was actually offered the position of chief rabbi in Britain in the mid-1960s, which initially he accepted, but then after 6 months before he came because of ill health, he decided not to come. Worth reading the biography of Yaakov Herzog about why he did or didn't come. He did actually die early of illness, but it wasn't that illness. But obviously he'd been, I think, warned against it in the ensuing 6 months, probably been told about he was walking right into the heart of the Jacobs affair. And anyway, it is said in his biography that the person who really pushed him to become the chief rabbi of England was his mother, the Rebbetzin Herzog, the daughter of Dayan Hillman, who said, this is our family business, not politics. But as it was, they produced two presidents as well, so that's not bad going, is it? And so on. And as you can see, these are all great scholars, the books they published. Why do I, and then that's the other side, I couldn't not have it. But why do I enjoy mentioning Rabbi Hillman today? Because yesterday, I was present, this picture is from yesterday. I was present at an event which took place at the President's residence here in Jerusalem with about 30 people. Rabbi Pini Dunner, one of the original Dunners from London, who for the 15 years has been the rabbi in Beverly Hills, has taken it as one of his life's works to produce new volumes of Sefer Or HaYashar. Or HaYashar is the monumental 23-volume work that Rabbi Hillman wrote both on the Torah and on the Talmud. And he finished the second volume, and he's brought a solidarity mission to Israel because of the war, and he set up an event at Bougie Herzog, the President Herzog, to present the new book, and this was the book that was presented yesterday, very sort of Talmudic book, but all of the front pages show that this is being supported by and promoted by the President himself, because it's his great-grandfather. And of course, he has, I suppose, if you ever say, who has the best rabbinical yichus in the world, you would say the President of Israel. He has Herzogs on one side, the Hillmans on the other side. You can't do much better than that. And this happened just yesterday. And when I heard, I said, you know, Penny, I'm giving a talk tonight. You should come along. He actually is with his group somewhere else, but we will discuss it anon, no doubt. I haven't time to go into that. And then we have the Agudas Yisrael, and then much later the founding of the Union of Orthodox Hebrew Rabbis. A similar story, and now I'm going to jump ahead because I want to look at long-term consequences. The actual short-term impacts of the conference, you could say, probably weren't that great. Yes, Hillman came to London. It took another 15 years for Agudas Yisrael, or for the Union of Orthodox, to set up as a separate organization, with one of only two rabbis still around from the 1911, that was Rabbi Dr. Victor Schonfeld, who was probably the most worldly of all of those Orthodox set of Rabbanim. Similar story actually took place in the 1930s after Rabbi Hillman resigned. 1932 he resigned and went to live in Eretz Yisrael, where he was very influential behind the scenes 2 years later at getting his son-in-law, Rabbi Isaac Halevi Herzog, selected as the next chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael after Rav Kook. And I don't mean that in any negative way at all, because in retrospect, Rav Herzog, there couldn't have been a better appointment to be the chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael and to be the first chief rabbi of the state of Israel. There couldn't have been a person more suited to that task in every sort of respect. But at the time, the competition was between Rav Herzog, who had only been to Israel once to bury his father 2 years previously, and between Rav Harlap, who was the student of Rav Kook, and they all went for Rav Herzog, partly because of Rav Shmuel Hillman's pressure. Very interesting that some of the Haredim, again in the autobiography of Rav Herzog, it says, some of the Haredim suggested to Rav Herzog that if he dropped the title doctor and only called himself Rabbi Isaac Halevi Herzog, not Rabbi Dr. Isaac Halevi Herzog, he would have a better chance of getting their votes. As it was, they all voted for him. You know, he did a PhD in the University of London in the 1920s on the issue of Tcheles and so on. So, and then in the 1930s, he went to Eretz Yisrael, and Chief Rabbi Hertz had to appoint a new Dayan. People said, you don't have to look any further. For the last 2 years, we've had in London someone called Rabbi Abramsky, who was rescued from exile in Siberia. And he's the right person. Hertz didn't want him. Much too strong-minded, characters, much too, in a sense, extreme for him. And originally they tried to persuade Rabbi Dr. Yechiel Weinberg, known to some of us as the Baal Sridei Eish, who wrote the Sridei Eish, who was the rabbi, the Rosh, I don't know what the actual term was, the head of the rabbinical seminary in Berlin, where Orthodox Rabbanim, including Rav Yosef Dunner, studied, to come. He met with representatives of the English Kehillah in Rotterdam. He accepted the position according to what we read in some of the books, went back to Berlin where his students said, no, you've got to stay here. And he then underwent a very, very severe, difficult Holocaust, and after the World War II, he survived and spent the rest of his life in the Swiss city of, where was the yeshiva? Montreux in Switzerland. And then he turned back to appoint Rabbi Abramsky, and one of Abramsky's main conditions was no porging, no hindquarters. To this day, I'm not talking about the private shlitter in England of the Haredim of Stamford Hill today. Today, that still is a rule with Shochtim and Abramsky. That was what a powerful character was. He then came to Israel as well in the early 50s, lived in the first buildings of Bayit Vagan, and became a prominent head of the Igud Yeshivot here in Israel, and also received the Israel Prize for Torani literature for his Perushim and the Tosefta, and so on. We're running out of time, so I'm going to rush through very quickly. Interesting letter from Rav Dessler to Rav Hillman. You know Rav Dessler was in England. He set up the Gateshead Kollel, but Rav Hillman, when he first came over, Dessler didn't have a parnosa, and he gave him the private tutelage of Solomon Sassoon, who was a very prominent rabbi, who at one point was even offered the chief rabbinate of Israel. Lived in Letchworth. You know the story of the Letchworth community, and so on. And he writes, and Rav Dessler really connected to the Gateshead world. He then became the Mashgiach of Ponevezh in his last few years. He writes a letter to Rabbi Hillman praising Sassoon. At the very end, he writes a postscript. Please send my regards to your son-in-law, Mofet Hador, the wonder of this generation. Who is he referring to? Rabbi Herzog, the chief rabbi of Israel. So the relationship then between what you would call Zionist and non-Zionist Rabbanim in the Haredi world was a bit different to the one we know today. I'm going to finish by showing you a set of pictures, just so that you can raise images. 1911 was the Aseifat.
Back one slide.
Sorry?
Back one. That's it.
Yeah, no, I'm going to get there. I want to go back. What? No, I want to, yeah. I'm going to explain to you what I'm going to do. So I asked at the bit, so there was this challenge to the Orthodox, and it's not clear that it brought more attention to them, but it's not clear that it really had a huge impact. I thought, would it really be interesting? Let's see who the Orthodox Rabbanim in England were 30 or 40 years later. I've got 3 sets of Rabbanim, all of them totally Orthodox, Shomrei Mitzvot, Taryag Mitzvot, etc., but 3 very different styles. The Haredi Rabbanim in England after World War II, Rav Ferber, Rav Elia Lopia and Bala Musar, Rosh Yeshiva Eitz Chaim. I suppose you could put Rav Unterman there. Remember, the British community created the first 3 chief rabbis of Israel, Rav Kook, Rav Herzog, Rav Unterman. Rav Unterman had been in Liverpool for 25 years or so. Diana Abramsky, Rav Dessler, and Rabbi Rogozhnitsky of Card. I've been looking for a good picture of him if anyone has. So that's one style of Orthodox.
This is the father, not the son.
The father, yes. I'm talking about the post-World War II period. I know, Mary, if I get anything wrong here, you're going to be the first to correct me. So that's one style of post-World War II Rabbanut. You had another very impressive group of Rabbanim, any one of whom could have been chief rabbi, but none of whom did. Rabbi Professor Louis Jacobs, Rabbi Solomon Sasson, Koppel Rosen, Isidore Epstein, Alexander Altman, all rabbi doctors. Interesting how they all have the same sort of goatee beards. You know, there's a certain style. They probably challenged the chief rabbi. Probably, a few of them could have been instead of Brodie, but for different personal and other reasons they weren't. And I think Brodie saw them as a challenge because, with all due respect to Chief Rabbi Brodie, these were people of major intellectual capacity. And you still had the Anglo-Rabbanim of the Anglo-Jewish post-World War II. I've just Reverend Livingstone, I just picked a few, Reverend Drucker, Rabbi Dr. Lou, still wearing their hats and dogs' collars and so on. So you had different styles, and you may argue, well, that's exactly how it's always been. You know, what's new under the sun? And that may be the case, but I think it gives food for thought. And so I thought I would finish with a gallery of pictures. This time, not the celebs, or not the individual celebs, but the team pictures, the groups. I've got now a series of 6 pictures following the conventions of Orthodox Rabbanim, all put together by the chief rabbi, over a period of time from the 1920s to the 1980s. And it's a question of style, isn't it? So let's go very quickly. Oh, sorry, this is when Rav Yosef Duna, Rav Yosef Duna died, passed away. he was one of the main pupils of Rav Yechiel Weinberger's rabbinical seminary. All of the Hespedim that were written about him in the Aguda press all said before World War II he attended the Berlin Yeshiva. No one said anything about a rabbinical seminary. They all say, or the Beis HaMedrash or the Yeshiva. But no one mentions the Berlin Seminary as such. The Association of London Rabbis was, I think I don't know enough about it. I think it was a group mostly of Federation rabbis who also set up to try and push forward. I think also the issue of refugees during World War II and also Orthodoxy after World War II. So let's just look at this gallery of change and I'll finish it there. So here we have 1923, Rabbi Hertz and his Anglo-Jewish Rabbanim. My grandfather is on the far left there with his hat. Chaplains of the ministry. A few years later, a great picture, again Rabbi Hertz in the middle with his Anglo-Jewish Rabbanim. There are two people there with hats. One was my grandfather. Many of them had dog's collars. Not all of them were wearing kippot. This was the Anglo-Jewish Orthodox ministry in 1929. Again in 1932. This picture actually appears in the back of that great book, Peter Renton's book, The Lost Synagogues of London. Try and get hold of a copy on eBay. You'll be paying £250 for it. It's very rare. I've got 2 copies at home and I'm not letting them go. 1950s. I once put this picture, you remember me? I put it up and asked people to name people. Rabbi Brody is standing right at the back. And I can see my very young father, who was then coerced into being the secretary. They always got a young minister to be the secretary, the honorary secretary, to do all the hard work. And Rabbi Jacobs is there somewhere. I think if you were to come and examine this picture more closely, many of you would remember faces and pictures of that time. The 50s, but again, still dogs' collars, but slightly different. Coming through the 1960s, just suits, no dogs' collars, coats and ties. In Manchester, I think that's Diane. What's the Manchester Diane's name at the front? Diane Goldvich at the front with Chief Rabbi Yakubovich. And Yakubovich certainly wasn't of the old Anglo style. Again in Manchester with Darren Ehrenschreier at the front. And the most recent picture I have of Rabbanim, I think that's in Finchley Shul, again put in by the Chief Rabbi, but a very different style. So I end with the question and say, it's an interesting history. Did the Leeds conference, beyond its own impact in that particular year or two, have a greater impact in the long term? Today, of course, the rabbinate of the Anglo-Jewish ministry is more in that direction than it was at that time, but it's still not what you would call a Haredi rabbanut. But I think that the Leeds Aseifat was the first time they got together as a group and called challenge on the Anglo-Jewish ministry and the Chief Rabbi, and by that virtue alone, it's a very interesting point in Anglo-Jewish history. Thank you.
Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Sherlock?
You just point to whoever.
Yeah. Gentlemen over there in red.
Was Rabbi Solomon David Sassoon of the Sassoon family, which included C3 Sassoon the poet?
I think all the Sassoons were related, but he was part of the rabbinical group. His father was David Sassoon, who actually I think was the one to relocate from Baghdad to England, or was it even before him? Not from Baghdad, from India.
Wait a second, wasn't he in life began at a line?
No, much later.
Yeah.
So he relocated with all his wealth and this fantastic library he had. And of course, Rabbi Dr. Solomon Sassoon was privately educated by Rav Dessler. He became the Rav in Letchworth during World War II. At one point, if you were at the Letchworth lecture by Yankee Fachler, he actually talked about the post-World War era, but during World War II there was also a separate Kehillah of the more Haredim there, and he had this fantastic library. And Fachler once said to me, one of the Fachler brothers, said, on Shabbat afternoon we used to go, this is already in the 50s, we used to go to Rabbi Sassoon's house for a shir in Chumash or a shir. He said, 30 years later we understood we'd been learning from a book which has just been sold for £3 million. Wow. But they're all part of the wider family, whether they were cousins or distant relatives, I'm not so sure. Mayor, can you answer that?
I think they were second cousins, but Siegfried wasn't Jewish.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Siegfried died as a Catholic.
So Siegfried's mother was a Thornycroft,
Yeah.
related to a former British government minister.
By the way, those who don't know, I'm going to do you a bit of PR. I don't know whether you wanted it or not. Rabbi Meir Selaznik, formerly the rabbi of the Bush Synagogue, he is a walking encyclopedia of every rabbi or person, and he will tell you who is third cousin and son-in-law and how he's related to you. And whenever I get a request like that from someone, I immediately send it to Meir, and within 10 minutes he's back with all the answers. Yes.
The question of dog collars and reverend, was this Rabbi Adler's doing?
Certainly the issue of reverend. Rabbi Adler didn't want anyone else being called rabbi. And he, even if you were the biggest rabbi with the biggest smicha, there was only one rabbi, that was the chief rabbi. I'm not sure who introduced dog. I mean, I think Raymond Apple, Zeichet Tzadik Livracha, wrote an article about the canonicals and the dog's collars. I mean, it mostly came from the idea that the Anglo-Jewish ministry at the end of the 19th century, to become more accepted in England, wanted to look like the Protestant clergy.
The Anglicans.
The Anglo clergy, sorry, yeah. And they wanted to look like them so they would be more respected when they walked down the streets and in front of their congregations and so on. But certainly the issue of reverend, even under Hertz in the beginning, he didn't like other people being called. I have an invitation, a copy of an invitation. My grandfather, Rabbi Yehuda Newman, was installed as the rabbi of the Notting Hill Synagogue in 1921 or 22. He called his childhood friend from Leeds, who was also a relative, who was then the rabbi in Belfast, if you maybe have gone to Dublin already, Rabbi Herzog, to come and go. You've gone to Dublin to come and give one of the speeches, the induction. They sent the invitation out, and the invitation went out saying that amongst the speakers would be Rabbi Herzog, Chief Rabbi of Ireland, and I have a copy of the letter which Chief Rabbi Hertz wrote to the secretary of the Notting Hill Synagogue saying, Chief Rabbi Hertz would very much like to come to the occasion, but you must correct the invitation because in the United Kingdom there is only one Chief Rabbi.
Not anymore. Maybe I can just add something here. There's a story I heard years ago about an American serviceman during the Second World War in Britain who needed advice from a rabbi, maybe somebody with Yontif, but anyhow, gets an address and he finds his way to the house and he knocks on the door and the door opens and there's a man, clerical collar, black front, bareheaded, no beard, and he said, oh, I'm sorry, I must have come to the wrong house. And he said, no, you know, who are you looking for? And he said, I'm looking for Rabbi Cohen. But I'm Rabbi Cohen. American Jew says, Goy Gadol Atzum V'Rav.
So if you're going to end with a joke, I must end with a joke in these very difficult times. You know, one of the things they didn't discuss at the Leeds Aseifat was about mixed choirs. They did say about dancing, theatre and so on. And you know, mixed choirs carry on. Again, Raymond Apple is the person to Zichron Livracha to give the talk about it. If you've heard this joke, then you've obviously had Elkan Levy speaking to you. But Elkan tells the story, and he argues that it's totally true. That at the height of the controversy over mixed choirs, we're talking about 1960s, the last shul to have a mixed choir was, as you know, Hampstead, Dennington Road, which was also Rabbi Raymond Apple's shul. And it was customary at the time that Rabbi Brody, the chief rabbi, would always go and daven and preach at Hampstead on Shmini Atzeres. And remember, he lived in Hamilton Terrace. John Wood wasn't a big walk, 30-minute walk. I've done it myself. Not that I lived in the chief rabbi's residence, but I had an apartment in St. John's Wood. And the story is told that, of course, Brody very much wanted to fall in with the Haredi world, and that's why I think he was, to a great extent, he was challenged by Rabbi Jacob's intellect and, of course, the various views that were posited around. And he was against the mixed choirs. And before Shmini Atzeres, his secretary, phoned the president of Hampstead and said, you know, the chief rabbi is coming and there's this controversy about the last order, perhaps you won't have your mixed choir on Yom Tov when he comes. And the president said, no way. He said, this is our minhag, we have a mixed choir. No. Chief Rabbi Brody walks over to Hampstead, Dennington Road on Shmini Atzeres. He's greeted at the front of the shul. This is the middle of the week, Shmini Atzeres. Greeted at the front of the shul by the president of the shul. He says, for Yom Tov, Chief Rabbi, you'll be pleased to know we don't have a mixed choir today. So Rabbi Brody said, that's very good to hear. What happened? He says, all the men have gone to work.
That's a good one.
Thank you.
Right. Oh, very nice indeed. Thank you very much. Okay. Before Kenneth takes over...
No, Mayor Celestine is giving the vote of thanks.
Yeah, but you speak before. I just wanted to say a couple of things. At the last meeting, as far as I remember, I paid a very brief tribute to our old friend Rabbi Raymond Appel-Al-Bashon, who had just passed away. There was a big item about him in the Jewish Chronicle, nothing for some reason here. Since then, we've lost another committee member, that is Professor Stuart Stanton, with whom I have a very long connection because he came from Ilford, where my family settled in the early 60s. Probably you don't know that his mother was a sister of, what was the name of their family? I can't remember. Epstein. No. Gertie something, right? Anyway, that doesn't matter. In other words, Rabbi Dr. Epstein, the principal of Jewish College, and he was the brother-in-law of the Stantons. So this is an interesting point. Okay, there will be probably a committee meeting held very soon because we've just lost these two members, and we really need to be fortified. We need some new blood. If anybody is interested in offering their services, I'll be glad to hear from them. And there will be a meeting taking place in the not too distant future to go into this. Right now, who is going to give the vote of thanks?
Rabbi Celestine.
Rabbi Celestine, very good.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I just wanted to make one particular correction to our speaker. You started off by referring to Diane Reinhardt. Reinhardt belonged to a totally different group of Anglo-Jewry. Yeah. You meant Diane Weinovitz.
Oh, sorry, you're
right. I had to mention it. But let's still have the video going, so that if anybody listened to it and listened to the end, they'll know it was Weinovitz or not Weinovitz.
You're right.
When I was coming, I was thinking to myself that I'm going to enter into a meeting where I will feel schizophrenic. Why schizophrenic? Because after all, my whole career was most of it was as a rabbi in the United Synagogue, and therefore I belonged to the group with the dog collars and the goatee beards and so on. But I wasn't related to any of the rabbis you mentioned, apart from the fact that Dr. Homer and his siblings, who were first cousins to my grandparents, his grandfather was Rabbi Abba Werner, who I'm sure would have been a major person in the conference if he hadn't died before. And therefore, I grew up thinking Rabbi Abba Werner was the person. And if you were on his side, you were right. and if you were on the other side, you were wrong. And of course, I end up schizophrenically having a job under the successors of Chief Biography. But then looking at the photos of the people you had, I realized I'm not the only person with schizophrenia. Your own father was a United Synagogue rabbi whose father was a Federation rabbi, and his uncles also, your father's uncles were also United Synagogue rabbis, United Synagogue type rabbis, and their father was one of the people in this conference. And then we got Rabbi Hirsch Horowitz, whose grandson Moshe Davis just happened to run the chief rabbi's office in the 1970s. And virtually everybody there had children or grandchildren, with the possible exception of the son of Rabinovitz. Oh no, even the son of Rabinovitz had a son, Reuben, who was rabbi in Birmingham. So in actual fact, we're all schizophrenic because we've got this connection, emotional connection to the people who had the Aseifat in Leeds, but we sort of have moved into and taken over, or at least before we made Aliyah, the Kehillos which they were criticizing. It's possible that we actually made those Kehillos a little bit more orthodox, so there was a sort of combination. So on behalf of everybody, I just want to thank you for a wonderful lecture explaining the whole picture, not just the conference itself, but the background to it. Thank you very much.
I want to mention one other thing. You may have seen, some of you may have seen, in one of the pictures, the figure of the Reverend Arthur Saul Super, who was the editor of the Children's Haggadah, which was present in, I think, many households. I had the dubious pleasure of being attacked by him in Johannesburg at a public meeting. I don't know what it was I said, but he was a very touchy individual, an old man, very crabby in those days, and well, you know, one has to be forgiving. But I just mentioned that because I saw the picture then.
Okay, so anyway, the Society is going to have a rest over the summer. We'll be back after the Chagim, and if anybody is interested in our book, Simon, Out of Zion, copies are available, and I'm going to give a copy as gift to our,
thank you very much,
our guest speaker.
Thank you.
You can downsize his library with other stuff.
No, I don't. The truth is that my family, they did become United, but they weren't from that background. They grew up in the Federation, they grew up in the Orthodoxy, and today I understand why my father from day one disliked intensely as a young minister having to wear canonicals. It just wasn't his style. And when actually we moved to Barnet in 1969, one of the conditions he made with the shul was that he would never again have to wear canonicals apart from a rabbi's hat, and obviously on Rosh Hashanah and Kippur white gowns. And that was part of his background. Yeah.
That's a predecessor.
Thank you very much.
When I got to Birmingham, I was astounded. When I got to Birmingham, I was astounded. Have you ever been to Birmingham?
Oh, sure.
In the old days?
I know that he was. Yeah.
By the way. Yeah, but he was the other shul. No, Singer's Hill. Yes.
Really? Even
yes. And furthermore, Singer's Hill doesn't do
You come across Rabbi Athens, been in the shop.
Yeah. You know, there are other people I wanted to stick in, but it's just impossible. Moshe Eliezer. Okay.
We get a
I told him.